everything in between, is much friendlier to the contrarian contours of modern conservatism than the elite consensus obeyance of modern liberalism. Neither the Joe Rogan Experience nor its peer programs are explicitly political or at all moments geared toward promoting a pro-Trump worldview. They talk about sports, entertainment, culture, working out, humor, dating, video games, whether aliens exist, whether they visited us recently, and all sorts of other topics. But the cumulative effect is a friendliness toward dude topics, political incorrectness, mainstream skepticism that inexorably channels viewers toward the Republican Party. The Democrats are not wrong to want their own version of this, or at least a competitor who can staunch the bleeding in terms of youth enthusiasm for progressive politics. To that end, the New York Times reported this week, top Democratic donors, consultants, political operators, former government officials, and activists are working to spend millions of dollars searching for their very own liberal Joe Rogan. At donor retreats and in pitch documents seen by the New York Times, liberal strategists are pushing the party's rich backers to reopen their wallets for a cavalcade of projects to help Democrats, as this cliche now goes, find the next Joe Rogan. That's from the New York Times. The Times continues. The proposals, the scope of which has not been previously reported, are meant to energize glum donors and persuade them that they can compete culturally with President Trump if only they can throw enough money at the problem. Look, these are not theoretical plans. The Times detailed efforts by several well-funded Democratic organizations to recruit talent by raising and spending millions and millions of dollars. An illustrative example is Project Bullhorn, which aims to spend $35 million to supplement the efforts of left-leaning YouTube channels and also to book left-leaning YouTube hosts on bigger and better media platforms. The Times, to its credit, is keenly aware of the overarching problem these efforts will encounter. Quote, the quiet effort amounts to an audacious, skeptics might say desperate, bet that Democrats can buy more cultural relevance online despite the fact that casually right-leaning touchstones like Mr. Rogan's podcast were not built by political donors and did not rise overnight. Indeed, no amount of money can pay for authenticity, and Democratic efforts to coronate a liberal Joe Rogan, no matter the price tag, they allied the unfortunate reality that liberals already had their own Joe Rogan. His name was Joe Rogan. Today, Rogan is a supporter of Trump who pals around with Elon Musk and Tucker Carlson and Kid Rock and other right-wing media figures at UFC fights. But just a few years ago, he had endorsed Bernie Sanders for president and promoted skepticism of corporations from a left-leaning perspective. Now, many in the mainstream media might find this odd. How does one go from endorsing the avatar of democratic socialism in 2020 to endorsing Donald Trump in 2024? But in truth, it's directionally consistent with the paths taken by other leftist alternative media and political figures. Prior to 2020, leftist alternative media was the home for skeptics and contrarians. There was the Young Turks, the Jimmy Dore Show, even Rising, this show, which catered to a much more left-leaning sensibility under the previous hosts, Crystal Ball and Sagar and Jetty, who departed this program to launch their own channel, Breaking Points, in 2021, before yours truly took over. There was Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi, Russell Brand. There was Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard, progressive Democrats who became popular for making frequent appearances on such programs. Now, many of those personalities associated with those programs, they would deny that they've moved to the right or joined the Republican Party, though RFK Jr. and Gabbard obviously have. And you know what? In most cases, they more or less have a point. I agree with them. It's not so much they changed, they didn't change. Rather, their audiences changed. Undeniably, a main motivating factor was COVID-19. As an observer of left media trends whose own show was growing in popularity at the time, I had a front row seat to the civil war that broke out over the response to the pandemic, which some lefties still view as a mass disabling event. Others viewed as a convenient excuse for tyrannical overreach on the part of the government. This later attitude was also the view of most people on the right, and thus significant segments of the Joe Rogan left found themselves making common cause with MAGA. As a result, the Trump media coalition is for people who distrust elite institutions, legacy journalism, and the expert consensus. Leftists who wanted to remain true to their anti-establishment brand have found the audience is bigger on the right. Meanwhile, the anti-Trump coalition is more or less satisfied, as far as I can tell, with traditional media offerings, print journalism, cable news, etc. Yawn. Therein lies the problem. a new liberal Joe Rogan must rise organically, but such an individual is likely to already exist in the mainstream media or quickly become captured by it, which is a fine career path for that person as far as it goes, but is unlikely to lure undecided or independent voters back to the Democratic folds. Merely throwing money at the problem is a non-starter, since Democratic elites picking the next liberal Rogan creates a kind of paradox. If he's chosen, he ain't Rogan. Moreover, if they did somehow find a popular heterodox podcaster who appealed to young males and possessed the ability to steer them away from Trump, the Democrats would turn on this person the second he called out woke shibboleths or made a serious challenge to the party's establishment. In other words, the very characteristics that make a Rogan are anathema to the modern Democratic Party.
I think Democrats smartly realize that podcasts, 3-hour conversations are much better to humanize people than a 60 minutes interview, as somebody who loves 60 minutes.
Yeah.
But I do understand there's two different audiences, and you have to be aware and cognizant of what happens when you have intentionally created spaces for real conversations. You can't plan everything you say over 3 hours. That's why Joe Rogan is so popular. I also think that Joe Rogan is this autonomous person that is making his own decisions every day, has people on that he likes, and then he'll be critical of them, and he just is allowed to be a free thinker. And so that's not something that a political base can fund. That doesn't come and be built.
Exactly.
So my question is this like a new shiny object for Democrats, or is this a serious plan? And I think that is the real thing that the Democratic Party has to grapple with, because they constantly like the new shiny object. They threw every single new shiny object at the 2024 election and lost. And so I think it's time for a different plan, maybe adjacent to this plan, but I wouldn't say that this should be what we're hearing coming out of those donor retreats is let's find an influencer. Because while I understand how important influencers are in the whole YouTube space and everything online, I do think that it's an entire ecosystem. It's not just one show that's going to make major waves. What Trump did is very intentional. He allegedly or reportedly talked to his son about all the popular podcasts that his son, who is of college age, is interested in and listening to, and intentionally target every single one of those outlets in addition to whatever his team compiled. So this could be In the Weed podcast that a young male is telling him that he's interested in. So Joe Rogan was the obvious choice, but he also did like 50 others. And so I think that's important to remember, that it's not just Joe Rogan. It was an ecosystem echoing some thoughts from Joe Rogan, and that is not something that can be created overnight or with money.
Right. With money, I think, is the key insight, because I agree with the Democrats that it would behoove them, it would benefit them to have a Joe Rogan type figure, or a number of them, who are trying to pull people back, who are not just echoing everything the Democratic Party thinks and says in the kind of finger-wagging way that is so turned off young males. But you can't have the Democratic Party, its elite donors, they can't pay for that. It's got to be genuine. It's got to be ground up. It takes time. There are, I think, people who are basically liberal and basically think Democrats are better than Republicans, but who have criticized Democrats and have some, cross-party credibility. Maybe Jon Stewart, maybe like Bill Burr or something like that. I've seen him on with Bill Maher, and he's clearly more unfriendly to Trump than Bill Maher is, and is kind of been like, well, what are you talking about? But isn't Trump, in a way that seems like you have independent thoughts and you're not just echoing a party? That's what they need. But I don't think, the America's Got Talent, American Idol version of this contest is likely to deliver the goods.
Hopefully we'll hear more reports about what else is coming out of the Democratic Party. This is one start of a good idea, but we need to hear all the rest of them. Coming up, 2 Israeli embassy staff workers were shot dead outside of the Capitol Jewish Museum in D.C. We're on top of that story.
very sad news. 2 Israeli embassy staff members were killed last night during a shooting outside the Capitol Jewish Museum in D.C. Authorities have identified a sole suspect, 31-year-old Elias Rodriguez from Chicago, who chanted "Free, Free Palestine" while in custody. We have video of that. Let's take a look.
Outside.
No. Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine! Free, free Palestine!
The man and the woman killed have been identified as Jewish American citizen and an Israeli citizen holding a German passport. Their names are Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Milgram. The 2 were a young couple that were about to be engaged, according to Israel's ambassador to the U.S. D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser held a press conference on the incident. Let's take a look.
The horrific incident is going to frighten a lot of people in our city and in our country. And I want to be clear that we will not tolerate this violence or hate in our city.
There's been an outpouring of posts on social media condemning the shooting. President Trump writes on Truth Social, "These horrible D.C. killings, based obviously on anti-Semitism, must end now. Hatred and radicalism have no place in the USA. Condolences to the families of the victims. So sad that such things as this can happen. God bless you all." The Israel Foreign Ministry says, "We are shocked and horrified this morning by the news of this brutal terrorist attack that claimed the lives of 2 of our embassy staff members in Washington. We embrace the grieving families during this painful time, and we will continue to support them always." The suspect, Elias Rodriguez, was apprehended by the police, and he said he did it because of Gaza. Independent journalist Ken Klippenstein obtained a manifesto that he says was written by Rodriguez. The Hill has not independently confirmed its authenticity, but I personally generally trust Ken's reporting. The manifesto offers further evidence that Rodriguez was explicitly motivated by a desire to punish Israel for its actions in Gaza. So very tragic happenings, very sad to hear, very sorry for those families, and hope they have, wishing them all comfort and good thoughts at this time. I'm sure there is likely to be strong condemnation of either far left protesting or anti-Israel protesting taking place. Now, I think it's, of course, you are well within your rights to be opposed to what Israel is doing, and it is not on you if someone takes that to some extreme and commits violence, but I'm sure people will be raising that issue. Violence is never the right way to solve problems, and will, in fact, even from a pro-Palestinian perspective, is going to backfire on their cause, as it engenders obviously sympathy for the people killed. It will not engender sympathy for the pro-Palestinian cause. So just a horrible thing to happen in all respects.
For sure, the 2 young people had their whole lives ahead of them.
Yeah.
And so it's a horrible incident that should be condemned across the board. I know the New York Times was talking about how people from Israel have had a fear of traveling, especially to the United States and Europe, because of the recent rise in violence. There was an incident at the London embassy, the Israel embassy in London, where they had to apprehend somebody. Luckily, nothing happened there, but this was just a month ago. I do think that it's important not to politicize a horror like this, because you're going to diminish the real tragedy and the pain of the victims and their families that they're feeling right now. And I do understand that even in Israel, there are some left-leaning leaders that are blaming Netanyahu. And over here, I'm sure there are going to be, as the days go on, especially from the Republican Party, blaming Democrats for this. But I don't think that we should ever conflate violence to freedom of speech. And we both agree strongly about freedom of speech, but also understand that these horrific acts should be condemned, and they ruin everything that people are fighting for through freedom of speech. And so when people do crazy violence like this, we have to condemn the murderer and really look into what's wrong with them personally, and not kind of broad stroke paint the entire initiative that maybe they were screaming that they're representing, because I'm sure the people who have been peacefully protesting don't feel the same way as him in a violent, reprehensible manner.
I certainly hope not. I don't. I think most of them do not. I think some of the more militant protesters do. Should note, this has been reported by the media, that Fox News reports this, that they were actually, the event taking place at the building was focused on finding humanitarian solutions in Gaza. So these were these people who were killed were there to attend an event to discuss ways to bring an end to the violence, and were brutally murdered. So it's just it's a horrible thing to happen, and very tragic. And our thoughts.
I think there's some urgent work to do of confronting hate in all its forms, right? And I think that first comes with solidarity, and that's why it might be important now for an overall temperature check to bring the temperature down. Like, we are in the early stages of a new presidency and figuring out ways to go across the aisle and, try to work with foreign nations and figure out what our country wants most, but most importantly, how to create peace around the world if we're going to be involved in these conflicts. And I think that is really the beginning to trying to bring the temperature down around this whole conversation. But obviously, I never want to attach any violent act to any cause. I like to look at the single individual.
Well, and I always point out when things like this happen that in this country, political violence is thankfully very rare. We have, unfortunately, way too much violence in this country, but politics is not usually the motivating factor. You hear about it when it does happen because it is rare, but this is clearly a case where it is politically motivated violence, and we certainly don't want to go down have that be increasing and suddenly start living in a very different country where it is routine for people to blow each other away when they disagree on politics or world events. That is not, that's what people in third world countries have to deal with. That's not what we have to deal with here. So it is very important to remain steadfast in opposition to taking matters into your own hands. That kind of thinking is not likely to prevail, even on behalf of a cause you may fervently support.
Agreed. And again, condolences to the family and people involved. Yes. Up next, what some are calling another Oval Office ambush. Did you guys see it? This time it was with South African president.
Honor to be with the President of South Africa, President Ramaphosa, and he is a man who is certainly in some circles really respected, other circles a little bit less respected, like all of us in all fairness.
We all like that.
Awkward start to a tense meeting between President Trump and South African President Cyril Ramaphosa that some are likening to the Oval Office ambush of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky.
President Ramaphosa making the trip to Washington to, quote, reset the relationship between the two countries after South Africa was one of the many countries targeted by Trump's tariffs and has been accused by President Trump of condoning a genocide on white South Africans or Afrikaners.
At one point, Trump even stopped the press event to play a video of a South African party leader calling for the killing of white farmers. That president, Ramaphosa, pushed back hard on those comments. Let's watch.
Our government policy is completely against what he was saying. And they're a small minority party, which is allowed to exist in terms of our constitution.
But you do allow them to take land.
No.
You do allow them to take land.
Nobody can
and
take
then when
land.
they take the land, they kill the white farmer. Look, these are articles over the last few days. Death, 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 horrible death.
Trump then turned his attention to the press in the room, and he railed against the media for not covering what he calls a genocide. Take a look.
We had real reporters, they'd be covering it, but the fake news in this country doesn't talk about that. Why did they give us a plane to the United States Air Force? That's what that idiot talks about after viewing a thing where thousands of people are dead.
I'm sorry, I don't have a plane to give you.
I wish you did. Okay.
The two world leaders are set to meet again today at the White House. And hopefully it's not as much of a disaster as yesterday. Wait, let me tell you. As a journalist, I just don't understand. So he's pulling up articles and saying death, death, death. Okay, if we go through the amount of murders that happened in, let's say, New York City, just an easy example, would we call that a genocide if we went through the articles, death, death, death? That's what he's talking about. He's not showing real information and real facts that relate to a genocide. And so when you look at the numbers, because I did, 60 white farmers were killed last year in South Africa. And while any amount of farmers that are killed is a bad thing, that is not that's a very minuscule number compared to the 19,000 South Africans as a whole that were murdered last year. There is a crime problem in South Africa, having spent a lot of time there, and I think he needs to stop combing over the real issue and talk about the actual issue, which is why we're deciding and picking and choosing who we're letting into the country based on dire circumstances, when one country actually has a dire circumstance like Venezuela and another country actually does not have a dire circumstance. And so, like Tim Kaine said when he was yelling at Marco Rubio,
their leaders are calling for them to be killed, but
no. Okay, so let me go back and explain that to everybody. So there in the 1980s, when there still was apartheid in South Africa, there was a chant called "Kill the Boer," and they were saying let's get rid of this oppression and apartheid. Do you know what was happening during apartheid? Black people or Black South Africans were being killed. Yeah. So naturally,
I don't know black people or white people.
No, naturally there was naturally there was a revolt against saying they didn't want to be oppressed anymore, and so that turned into something under Nelson Mandela's party that turned into a resistance movement that was get us out of this oppression. And so that's what that chant was. But that chant didn't actually lead to any deaths. And so now we saw Ramaphosa, he's not even associated with the same party as Nelson Mandela. So none of his party or anybody around his party is chanting "Kill the Boer." And it's more important to note that while freedom of speech is actually intact in South Africa and also should be in the United States, people can chant, like you said, whatever they want. And it doesn't mean, unless they're actually doing negative, harming actions, that they can be prosecuted for it. So showing these articles and showing the video of a protest does not lead to causation of death in South Africa of farmers. It's just actually not a genocide. And so I just want to be telling the truth, especially coming from the man who claims that fake news is running rampant. He's actually providing fake information. There's not a genocide in South Africa.
Well, I didn't call it a genocide. I think killing is wrong. I mean, genocide is, you asked if I would describe the New York situation. No, although, if people, genocide is if people are being, deliberately killed by some organized force, some government or something for reasons of racial or religious oppression, right?
But the people who killed the farmer were the same random acts as the same people that killed people in murders in New York.
I just don't care. This is beside the point to me, because the issue is whether they should be allowed to immigrate here. And I have no problem with them immigrating here. And our government has no problem with them immigrating here. And it sounds like you don't really have a problem with them immigrating here either. So then what's the issue? They're coming here, a small number of affluent white farmers. It's fine. Done.
The bigger issue is
Stamp that passport, baby.
President Trump has a track record of publicly humiliating people that are supposed to be our allies in the Oval Office on television. And so, again, this was another visually stunning moment, like we saw with Zelensky, where he is condescending a world leader to what reason, to what end? That world leader came here to actually try to open up trade like you like with South Africa. And Elon Musk was there because he wants to bring in more charging stations to South Africa. I think it'll be a great place for Elon Musk to continue investing.
Don't we
Having
want more
spent time
charging
there,
stations
there
in
are
South
plenty of rich
Africa?
people in South Africa. But Trump came there with a different agenda. He came there to try to target every reporter that had a question about anything else he has going on.
Well,
And
they don't
he
want the
came there
US
with
government-
articles just to do this.
They don't
and
want-
and do this whole
Let me say
performance.
that they don't want the U.S. government's help building charging stations in South Africa because we built zero, even with $1 gazillion spent on the project, because we can't build anything in this freaking country. I think it is a benefit of Donald Trump that he just what happens behind closed doors under Democratic governance or normal governance happens out in the open under Trump, and I think that's a benefit. Right. He had the fight with Zelensky that probably another leader would have had behind closed doors that you wouldn't have heard about. You would have heard some orchestrated media report about how they're on the same page.
But he didn't have the fight with
Putin. But you say it in person.
He didn't have the fight with Putin. He had a closed-door meeting for 2 hours.
Trump just says what's on his
mind.
mind.
Putin has not came to a resolution.
What's on his mind to people.
So
he says it in public. I think that's good.
He gets pushed around by certain people, and then he tries to embarrass other people. Like Putin is pushing him around. He hasn't come to the table with Ukraine, not that we heard of all weekend. It was imminent when we heard them talk last time.
I like having a president who knows who he's talking to and is capable of some exchange, unlike, again, our previous president, who Democrats were going to, as a corpse, drag over the finish line and pretend he was capable of talking to world leaders. If it gets combative, that's fine. And honestly, they seemed like they were on perfectly good terms by the end of it.
But part of it is just that he's asking why the press isn't covering a genocide, and it's the same reason why we're not covering a genocide when someone's murdered in any other city in the United States. It's the same reason why China isn't covering genocides when a murder happens in the United States that has nothing to do with one specific
I don't think we want to get into China
okay,
not covering
but
genocides.
whatever it is.
China is very much not
Any
covering
country.
some genocides going on
Any
in
country.
China.
It's why Europe doesn't cover local murders. You know what I mean? He's not making sense.
And actually, China probably does cover every last thing the United States does wrong. Look at the evil Western imperialists and how bad their country is.
I just want to
stay in your home, citizen. Do not dissent.
I want him to be honest. That's not a huge task, a tall order for a president. I want him to be honest. And so I want him just to say what this actually is. I don't think anyone should be murdered. I condone violence in all of its forms. But I do think our president should be honest and not ask why the press isn't covering something that's a local issue with crime and has more to do with socioeconomic status in South Africa as opposed to race in South Africa. So
RFK Jr. next up, slamming the World Health Organization over its handling of COVID. More Rising right after this.
Like many legacy institutions, the WHO has become mired in bureaucratic bloat, entrenched paradigms, conflicts of interest, and international power politics. WHO's priorities have increasingly reflected the biases and interests of corporate medicine. Too often it has allowed political agendas like pushing harmful gender ideology to hijack its core mission. And too often it has become the tool of politics and turned its back on promoting health and health security.
Strong criticism from Secretary of Health and Human Services Robert F. Kennedy Jr. addressing the organization he's criticizing, the WHO. That message was sent to the WHO this week to explain why President Trump chose to withdraw from the organization, and he urged other member countries to follow suit.
It comes as the international body adopted what it calls a pandemic agreement, an accord that says it will establish cooperation between members and access to resources like tests and vaccine should another global pandemic occur. But Secretary Kennedy has a different view of the agreement. Let's take a listen about what he said about that.
The WHO has not even come to terms with its failures during COVID, let alone made significant reforms. Instead, it has doubled down with the pandemic agreement, which will lock in all of the dysfunctions of the WHO pandemic response. The WHO, under pressure from China, suppressed reports at critical junctures of human-to-human transmission and then worked with China to promote the fiction that COVID originated from bats or pangolins rather than from a Chinese government-sponsored research at a biolab in Wuhan.
Kennedy also cited his and the president's discomfort with how much money the U.S. was giving the WHO and how much influence countries like China had in its decision-making. Now, while there was no immediate reaction from the organization or its delegates in the past, the WHO has denied allegations that it is too close to China and denied it mishandled the COVID-19 pandemic. We're probably going to fight about this one. I am happy to have us not involved in the WHO anymore.
Ridiculous.
I think, why is that ridiculous?
Because the WHO, like viruses don't respect borders. They don't respect borders at all, as we saw with COVID-19. And so withdrawing from the
WHO doesn't respect borders.
Yeah, but during a global health emergency, if we ever do, there's no coordination. There's lack of communication, and the U.S. interests are now put last if we're not part of a global organization. And so although there's disagreement about how COVID-19 was handled, not being a part of the larger conversation about what's going on will cause a rise in a bunch of things, like people trying to flee from certain circumstances and more people coming here. It will affect immigration. We have to be on the same accord. We have to be on the same accord with the world to make sure that our response is in line and in unison.
I agree with that. We need to work with other countries and coordinate efforts and sharing of resources. But the reason I despise the WHO and think we should get as far from this organization as possible, we should burn it to the ground, is because they did not foster international cooperation. They covered for the authoritarian regime of China. When COVID happened, that's what they did, is helped China cover it up. They were beholden to China. That's not just my opinion. This is reporting from the New York Times. In the hunt for virus source, the WHO let China take charge. As it praised Beijing, the World Health Organization concealed concessions they were making to China and may have sacrificed the best chance to unravel the virus's origins. They did that. When COVID unfolded, they made excuses for China's government. They said, let's not be anti-China. That would be racist. We can't have that. They helped an authoritarian regime cover up their complicity in an event that killed millions of people globally. They have no credibility to me. We should end the organization and finally start a new organization that will be truly collaborative between different countries. It's not because I don't want to be collaborative. I do. You're right that viruses don't abide by borders. Of course. We should pay attention to what other countries are doing. We should not be bound to follow the policies of a distant international organization that is bought and paid for by communist China.
I think this is about protecting lives and not scoring political points. And so we have to figure out, do you want to cast stones from the outside and just talk about what's going wrong? Or do you want to go inside it? Trump claims to be the man who can make a deal. So why doesn't he have conversations about what he would like to see done within an organization that already exists instead of creating another World Health Organization Part 2, and going through all the work and spending all the money that we don't have to spend to create something new? Why don't we figure out how to reform from within? Of course there's issues. issues. Of course, there's things to be looked at of how it can be handled better for the next time. But the only way you do that is by starting and having conversations about that early before we're in the middle of a crisis. And I think that one way to do it is to say, maybe not threaten to take your money out or take your money out completely, but go to the table and say what you want to see change, the same way that we do when we have conversations with politicians that want an office or a space or want our dollars for funding. We tell them what we're looking for. Sometimes we get it, sometimes we don't. With WHO, since we're one of the largest contributors to that organization, I think we have a lot of power in the conversation about what happens next.
I think if the WHO was as beholden to Russia as has been to China, it would be obvious to liberals and Democrats that we should not tie ourselves to it so closely. If it was, to use a favorite Democratic liberal mainstream media phrasing, echoing Russian disinformation, we would not want to be associated with it. That's what they would say. It echoes Chinese disinformation, disinformation on behalf of the Chinese government, which, by the way, is not in the interest of the Chinese people. It's not about blaming the Chinese people or anything of that nature. I wish they were liberated from this evil organization that wants to, destroy the planet, and unleashed, not deliberately, but unleashed a virus on the entire world and concealed their role in doing so. And we could have responded more efficiently. Fewer people would have died if we knew the full story from the beginning. But they wanted to hide their responsibility. I think that just cannot be waved away or overlooked. I think that is a very, very serious issue, and I do not have trust or faith in the WHO. I think that's not just a crazy right-wing or libertarian opinion, but an opinion of, frankly, even of like health experts, unless they've been, unless they're counting on research dollars that the WHO coordinates, they have some stake in defending the organization. That's a problem.
A pattern of this administration and people in it like RFK is make a huge decision, figure out how to solve it permanently later. And that is not a real way to protect Americans' interests. I think if RFK would have came forward with a plan, like you said, create an organization. Okay, that's going to take years and a lot of time and a lot of money. Like, create it now. By the time they're out of office and there's a new president, then we'll have the organization. So what's the plan right now? You're pulling out of the WHO, and then what? So if anything happens, we're just unprotected because it's better than being in bed with this organization that has for years helped us come up with coordinated efforts.
I don't think we're unprotected because we're not binding ourselves to some kind of international compact that is going to be unduly influenced by China.
So just no plan. So then no plan.
We have our own plan. I mean, we have our own. We have the CDC and the FDA. The European Union has their own health officials. Honestly, there were several points in the pandemic where I actually wished, and I've never said this ever before in my life, where I wished we were following the European rules because the European procedures were less strict than the U.S. ones. Europe did not recommend school closures. They were less strict on mask mandates, vaccine mandates. They had saner rules than the U.S. did, and we still had what we had. So it's not. And also, what do you mean? It's our own internal policies and guidance, and pharmaceuticals invented by American companies with American tax dollars. We're paying for all the research that makes overcoming COVID possible for everyone. So it's not like there's no plan. There is a plan. We're executing the plan. Everyone else is taking advantage of the plan. And at the same time, they want to say we have to kiss China's feet? No. I say no. No way.
We'll keep talking about this.
Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson calling Trump a monster after the DOJ launched an investigation into the mayor's hiring practices. We'll get into that, more Rising, right after this.
We have always known who he has been. This is not a surprise. He's a monster. Period. We have the most diverse administration in the history of Chicago. And he is threatened by that.
Those were Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson's fiery choice words for President Trump. His remarks come as Johnson is being investigated by the Department of Justice for Chicago's hiring practices. And it all comes after Johnson made these remarks. Let's watch.
Some detractors that will push back on me and say, you know, the only thing that the mayor talks about is the hiring of black people. No, what I'm saying is when you hire our people, we always look out for everybody else. We are the most generous people on the planet. Business and Economic Neighborhood Development, the deputy mayor is a black woman. Department of Planning and Development is a black woman. Infrastructure deputy mayor is a black woman. Chief Operations Officer is a black man. Budget director is a black woman. Senior advisor is a black man.
Assistant Attorney General Harmeet Dillon wrote in a letter to Johnson saying, quote, if these kinds of hiring decisions are being made for top-level positions in your administration, then it begs the question of whether such decisions are also being made for lower-level positions. The mayor is brushing off the investigation, saying he's, quote, not going to get intimidated. Johnson's office says white and black employees are the majority of the staff members. Just over 34% identify as black, while a little over 30% identify as white.
Chicago reporter William J. Kelly wrote on X, Johnson answers only to his base, pushing an agenda that leaves the rest of the city behind.
Reverend Al Sharpton says, quote, are we now saying it's criminal for black leaders to hire qualified black professionals? Is it a scandal to ensure representation in a city that looks like us? That's not corruption, it's equity.
Well, it's pretty straightforward. I don't care if 100% of the employees are black. I don't care if 100% of them are white or Asian or purple panda bears. They just should hire the most qualified people for the jobs, and it is in fact illegal to hire people for their race or not hire them for their race. So I think the investigation hinges on whether in those remarks he was saying, as he was listing the racial attributes of everyone he's picked for various positions, if they were picked because of those racial attributes, that is in fact illegal discriminatory hiring practices. If it just so happens that he thought those were the most qualified people and they happen to be black, then I don't care, that's fine. And I guess that's what we're going to discover.
Well, speaking of discriminatory hiring practices, Trump got his career start with discriminatory hiring practices in 1973. The Civil Rights Division,
like 800 years
filed.
ago.
Well, it doesn't matter. It's how he started. So we should be
he was
considering
accused of discriminatory hiring practices.
Yes, because several people of color were denied opportunities to rent out his apartments. The same ones that submit applications that were white got the apartment, and so it's just a matter of choice, which is what we're saying.
I don't know.
We can't. We might not be able to prove that he discriminated, but we can also say right now, looking at his cabinet, it's 80% white men. Should we examine that as well? It's not about who has the position. You're right. It's about most qualified. But the fact is that America, which is why there's organizations like the National Association of Black Journalists, because America is a good old boys club where people hire people who they see most often in their communities, who they're most comfortable with. That's something that we understand happens. And naturally, people might be in communities that look like them. And so this is something that's always happened. It's a social phenomenon, not something that you can point to and say, oh, is he the most qualified or not?
It's majority
but
white.
It's just happening. That's
white
what's
people
real.
are the majority of the country, so it's.
Yeah, but they're not 80% of the country, and so white men are not 80%.
It doesn't need to
so
reflect the exact. I don't
it
care.
Should
I don't
reflect.
care. I don't care if it reflects the demographics whatsoever. It could be 100%.
But
black.
there's
it could be 100%.
There's necessity to
old
have
Jewish ladies. I don't care.
But there's necessity to have. So you and I have different experiences purely based on the fact that we're different races, right? And that's okay or not okay. We both are wholly qualified to sit up here and have these dialogues.
But
it helps
too.
Right? But it helps. I'm a woman, you're a man.
Right.
It helps.
We were born in different places.
Right, Detroit, New York.
Right.
It helps to have different experiences. That's the whole point of diversity and inclusion. That's why we need it in this country, because it will bring different ideas and perspectives to the table to help bring the best result forward for the country and be a reflection of the country we live in.
But race is not always a proxy for actually having different experiences. I agree in theory that having different experiences can be an asset. So that is not a contention I am arguing against. But when you just say, oh, we need to have a certain number of people of a certain race, you assume then the experiences or the backgrounds or the perspectives will be different. I mean, frankly, class is a much bigger issue. If you get, and this is what has happened, for instance, in diversity university admissions, where they go, you try to turn up the dial on whatever, Native Americans or black people or Latino people, but you're just getting more affluent people in those categories. You end up not getting different backgrounds. They're all, trying to be on the water polo team and joining the marching band and padding their resumes with extracurricular activities. You're not actually, and especially if they're all, equally far left liberal people applying to universities, you're not actually getting difference of perspective or difference of ideology or difference of any of those things when you just assume that, more people of a different race automatically means diverse in some way. It's just skin color. Sometimes, I agree with you, sometimes it indicates some kind of different life status or some different perspective, but just assuming that you're accomplishing diversity if you do that is in my view the mistake that liberals make.
But also, you're just going to pick and choose an internal review in Chicago. You can do a review on your own office. Like, it could be with women. It could be, like, we're talking about a lot of women's rights that are on the ballot and have been for the last few years. Shouldn't women have a say in that conversation? Like, these are all different dialogues that we're having about President Trump and his executive orders and who they affect and people. And he's pointing.
Everything affects everyone. I don't like weaponizing identity and that only women can care about this, only some minority can bear that. It's all policy. It affects us all. We all get a vote. We all have a say.
Okay, all policy doesn't affect everyone all the time.
Well, it's not like abortion which is not, frankly, an issue that I'm particularly invested in or have really strong views myself. But it gets, put forth as some women issue, like only women can have some opinion on it. Well, from the conservative or pro-life perspective, it's a child being murdered. I get to have an opinion on that.
When we see a Congress full of men making that decision and women are sitting back like, oh, do I have a choice? That's problematic. You have to agree. That's not diversity of thought.
No,
when
I
we
don't
see
care at
all
all.
of one type of person sitting there having a conversation about a woman.
I don't care at all.
All right, Nancy Mace is using her naked image taken without her consent to advocate for voyeurism legislation. We'll discuss that next.
What?
Representative Nancy Mace had a not safe for work moment this week. She shared a blurred nude photo of herself during a House Oversight Committee hearing on surveillance in private places. She says the photo, which she described as a, quote, naked silhouette, was taken without her consent by her ex-fiance, and she's using the image to call attention to the issue and encourage other victims to come forward. Let's watch.
Justice shouldn't come in the form of real sentences, real fines, and real protection for victims. That's why I introduced the Sue Voyers Act, which creates a civil right of action for victims at the federal level. Secret recordings thrive in the shadows. These bills drag them into broad daylight. Liberty is not theory. It's the right to undress in peace, to live unrecorded without being filmed while naked. Let's make sure the law reflects that truth. We need laws with teeth, we need survivors with standing, and we need to leave predators with nowhere left to hide.
Mace says her legislation will create a civil right of action for victims. She also says it will expand the limited federal prohibition on video voyeurism.
The display is the latest in a series of explosive allegations she's made against her ex. She's accusing him and multiple others of recording videos of numerous women without permission. Mace's ex-fiancé and others have denied the accusations that she's levied against them. In a statement to The Hill, Mace's ex writes, "I categorically deny the false and outrageous claims made by Nancy Mace. This isn't advocacy, it's an abuse, exploitation of her political position for the sole purpose of promoting herself politically. Her allegations are absolutely baseless."
I like to start with, listening to women, hearing out their stories. I think privacy issues and concerns amongst women are real and valid. I do think that we should have a conversation about what the hearing was about. It focused on surveillance in private places, and that's a growing threat for women. They have pictures, even as young as
not just for women, it's a growing threat for everybody.
Yeah, but also, when it comes down to, the use of images and inappropriate images, especially for young kids with social media, there's a larger conversation about what we should consider criminal in this country or inappropriate and really condemn. And I think that that's something to point to. And whether or not you think she's doing it performatively, I think she's opening up the door for actual victims, because I don't know what her actual story in full is. And obviously this hasn't been litigated. But I think it's opening up the door for victims to come forward and know that they shouldn't feel censored and that they should, not be uncomfortable with sharing their story. And when people in higher positions do that, it really creates an opening for people to do that.
There are actually a lot of really interesting, thorny legal issues to get into here that we're unfortunately not going to have time for because we're going to have to go soon, that are much more interesting than, whatever Nancy Mace is doing.
You seem off-put by the fact that she even brought the picture up. Is it because with her ex-husband's response, you just think
I don't know whether, I don't want to litigate their relationship. I have no idea who is at fault or whatever the situation is. I do, in fact, find her a little bit attention-seeking, as do most people on the right at this point. She's kind of like Olivia Colman from The Favorite. Have you seen that scene? Look at me, look at me. Why are you looking at me? That's the impression I get from her. But I do think this is a very real issue. And obviously, if she was the victim of having, photos taken or videos taken without her consent, and then especially shared with other people, this is revenge porn. Exactly. I do think I'm an ardent First Amendment free speech person. I do think it would be okay to have new rules and new laws around revenge porn specifically. I don't think you should be allowed to share other people's nude photos and videos without their consent. I think if you do share them without their consent, there should be a burden. This is the legal issue because let's say you post them on it's probably not on Facebook, but on Pornhub. Let's say you post them on Pornhub. Does Pornhub have the legal right, the legal obligation to take those photos and videos down? It has been unclear. Now, Pornhub will usually take them down if you ask, but if they said there are other even less reputable sites that just won't take them down, can you force them legally in the same way you can force someone to take down if they do copyright infringement? You can force them to take, if they violate your copyright, you can sue them if they don't do that.
Right.
So there might need to be new laws, exceptions to Section 230 in this narrow category to require sites or third parties or whatever to take down non-consensual photos. Yes, I am generally supportive of a legislative approach there.
And if the goal for this is to start to protect privacy in that aspect, and she's adding this or thinking about adding this to the conversation, I think that the broader conversation that opens up doors for victims is more important than litigating her and her ex-fiance's drama and seeing which parts of it are true or false, right? That's not up to us. They could take it to court if it's that serious.
Yeah, that's fine. But there's an issue with her trying to, again, litigate accusations of wrongdoing or criminal wrongdoing against her personally in the Congress chambers, because you have broad rights to say things that may or may not be true and not be subject to libel lawsuits if you say them in Congress because of the way the Constitution works. And some people are wondering if she's making accusations she couldn't prove in court that would open her up to something. She's doing them in Congress where she has that kind of protection. Doesn't mean it's not an important issue. That does it for us today on Rising. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any of our content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, we're available anywhere you can listen to podcasts. That does it for us for the week. Or are you on tomorrow?
I'm not here tomorrow, but
Different
I had fun
people
with
tomorrow.
You guys.
See you later.